and D. Copras. The song remains a fan favorite and has had numerous covers since then from many notable bands, from Aerosmith to the Ramones, along with being parodied by The Simpsons movie with the Spider Pig gag. Another more recent thing that resulted from the cartoon series was the classic meme of Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man from the episode Double Identity, which has become so popular, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse movie of 2018 mocked it in an after-credit sequence when Spider-Man 2099 went back in time to meet the original Spider-Man. Meanwhile, back in the comic, Peter Parker graduated from high school and started to attend Empire State University, a nod to Columbia and New York, the real New York University, and became friends with Harry Osborn. Soon, Parker was no longer the nerdy kid from high school, but part of the gang, who hung out at the Coffee Bean modeled after the Greenwich Village. Of course, this is part of Stan Lee's overall plan to see Peter Parker grow into an adult in his role as Spider-Man, something else readers could relate to. As Spider-Man matured, so did they. In the real world, the Village Voice read an article on April 1st, 1965, called The Spider-Man Dilemma, Superhero, Anti-Hero, and Forest Hills. The article pointed out how popular Spider-Man was in college and how he was neurotic, along with Marvel being one of the first comic book companies to address the real world. In the New York Herald Tribune on January 9, 1966, it ran an article, Superheroes with Super Problems, with Spider-Man being highlighted. The article highlighted the diversity of the fans, as Stan Lee recalled a visit to the Marvel offices by famed Italian director Federico Fellini, who proclaimed to be a huge fan of Spider-Man. I magazine on February 1969 had the headline, The New Superhero is a Pretty Kinky Guy, and asked if you wanted to marry Spider-Man, but had matured. Most notably, though, it came with a miniature version of Amazing Spider-Man number 42 on the cover, though for some reason cut the Mary Jane sequence out, which is like the best part of the whole issue. However, even that couldn't save the floundering I magazine, which was canceled by its third issue. Meanwhile, Spider-Man had a trial run as a daily newspaper strip appearing in the Marvel Mania magazine number 3 and 4 in 1970 by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr., where he fought the Phantom Burglar. However, this was revealed to be an experiment by Lee and Romita Sr., and an actual daily strip wouldn't debut until years later. Marvel vs. International, a new club, was launched in 1969, complete with a magazine with the intention of replacing the Merry Marvel Marching Society. The second issue featured unused Steve Ditko art for Amazing Fantasy number 15, notably his cover that was rejected over Jack Kirby's, but it only lasted for 6 issues. The club also included posters such as one by Spider-Man by John Romita Sr., but ultimately the club itself would only last for 2 years. Also in 1969, Spider-Man made his unofficial live-action debut in the short fan film, They Were Around Long Before YouTube, believe it or not, by Donald F. Glut, which featured Spidey taking on the original villain Dr. Light. Naturally, being a fan film, the production is shoddy. Spidey's costume is pretty baggy looking at it, but retains some charm. You can still find it at YouTube if anyone is interested. Back in the comic, Captain Stacy, the father of Spider-Man's girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, died, while Spider-Man battled Dr. Octopus in the issue Amazing Spider-Man number 88 in September of 1970, where one of his mechanical arms pulverized the chimney, forcing the heroic Stacy to push an innocent kid out of the way, only to die instead. Rushing to his side, Spider-Man learns Captain Stacy always knew he was Peter Parker and employs him with his dying words to look after his daughter Gwen, who he loves so much. This would have career complications for Peter Parker's relationship with Gwen Stacy, as she openly blames Spider-Man for her father's death at his funeral. The loss of Captain Stacy, who first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 56 in January 1968, would be keenly felt with the audiences, as he's one of the few authority figures who respected Spider-Man, often defending his actions against others, being a respected member of the New York City Police Department. It will also be a prelude for even darker things to come. In Amazing Spider-Man number 96-98 on July of 1971, it featured an anti-drug story with Harry Osborn being an addict. Stan Lee loved the idea and had the endorsement of the U.S. Department of Health, who had approached him to use the comic book medium to educate the public on the dangers of drug abuse. However, the CCA refused to allow it due to its restrictions on depictions of drug use in comics, even if they were negative. Marvel ran the story anyway without CCA approval, which was written by Stan Lee with art by Jill Kane, and the positive reaction to the comic was overwhelming. The New York Times gave an excellent lineup, while Scholastic News Time on March 22, 1971 ran a story, Comics, Getting the Dope on Dope, quoting Stan Lee that if the story prevents one kid from drug abuse, it was worth it. The CCA was floundering in response, and the New York Times ran a story on May 2nd, 1971 called Sajam, Here Comes Captain Relevant by Saul Braun, in which he interviewed the CCA and its president, John Goldwater, also the co-founder of Archie Comics, who claimed his ejection was over a black drug-addicted kid nearly falling off the building with Spider-Man saving him, which they believe indicated sensationalism. Carmen Infantino, then the DC editorial director, also objected to the story, saying DC would love to do a drug abuse story, but only under CCA guidelines. John Goldwater said Marlon Goodman promised never to do it again, claiming Marvel was allowed one mistake after 15 years of good behavior. However, this mistake resulted in other publishers starting to explore the drug abuse issue, and in order for the CCA to remain remotely relevant, they were forced to change their rules for the first time in 17 years, not only allowing for depictions of drugs, but more subtle stories as well, such as cops allowed to be killed, criminals could get away with their crimes, and classic horror characters like vampires and werewolves could be depicted again. So as further demonstration of the power of Spider-Man, he helped form the first cracks in the CCA that will eventually lead to its downfall. By issue number 100, Peter Parker was tired of being Spider-Man, so he created a serum to remove his powers. However, it backfired, and instead he grew 4 more arms, now having 8 limbs like actual spiders. It would later be cured when his blood was mixed with Morbius, the living vampire, who will be introduced in the very next issue. For the record, probably my most valuable comic I have in my collection. I was a big fan of Morbius back in the early 90s. With issue number 110, Stan Lee stepped down as writer, giving the reins to Jerry Conway with issue number 111. During his run, Conway would include more traditional adventures with guest stars like Kazar, Doctor Strange, and the Incredible Hulk, while also writing probably the most pivotal story in Spider-Man's history. The death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man number 121 on June of 1973, where she is thrown from the George Washington Bridge, later altered to be the Brooklyn Bridge due to a mistake by the writer, by the Green Goblin and dies, despite Spider-Man catching her with his webbing. In the letters page of issue number 125, it's then revealed that the recoil of being caught by the webbing is what caused Gwen Stacy's neck to snap, killing her. The fall would have killed her anyway, but the point was made that Spider-Man couldn't have saved her no matter what. Green Goblin would die in the next issue, in issue number 122, and though Spider-Man complained in that issue that he was going to kill him for Gwen's death, in actuality he didn't. Instead, having the Green Goblin being impaled by his own Goblin Guider when he tried to kill Spider-Man. The story was done with art by John Romita Sr., encouraged by editor Roy Thomas, though they would later get death threats afterwards for it. One letter in issue number 127 by Richard Nathan from Van Nuys, California read, "Somebody ought to throw Jerry Conway off the George Washington Bridge to see if the fall kills him before the impact." Reportedly, even Stan Lee was surprised by the story and ordered no more deaths in Marvel for the time being. Nevertheless, the story holds up as a turning point in superhero comics, as they were now flawed and sometimes lost in the worst ways. While many comic book characters' deaths have since been reversed, Gwen Stacy's has stayed, and its impact is felt even today. With issue number 125, Ross Andru became the artist in October of 1973, and would even pencil the classic Superman vs. Spider-Man comic, a crossover between DC and Marvel in which Lex Luthor and Dr. Octopus tricks the heroes into fighting each other. Jerry Conway provided the writing, while Dick D'Argento inked. Dubbed the greatest superhero team-up of all time, along with being the battle of the century, it will be a comic moment in both companies' history, leading to future crossovers. In issue number 129, The Punisher was introduced in February 1974, created by Jerry Conway, along with the villain, the Jackal, Dr. Miles Warren. The Punisher, Frank Castle, was inspired by the Mike Bolan character from the Executioner novels, and in the issue was originally an assassin hired by the Jackal to kill Spider-Man, blaming him for the death of Gwen Stacy. His alter ego, Dr. Miles Warren, who first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 31 in February 1964, was Gwen and her friend's biology professor at Empire State University, and they fell in love with her. When this attempt failed, the Punisher would later become a hardcore vigilante we know and love today. As for the Jackal Dr. Miles Warren, he would later clone both Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker, forcing both Spider-Men to fight each other in Amazing Spider-Man number 149. In the conflict, both the Jackal and Spidey's clones seemingly die, but sadly that would not be the case for the latter, as he would come back to haunt Spider-Man in one of his lowest moments in decades later on. With the success of Spider-Man, a new comic book was launched, Marvel Team-Up number 1 on March 1972, the first story featuring Spider-Man and the Human Torch, written by Roy Thomas and art by Ross Andru, with inking by Mike Esposito. The comic would be used to provide fun and out there team-ups with various Marvel characters, including issue number 74, where he teams up with the cast of Saturday Night Live when they appear on the Late Night with David Letterman. Later, Spidey's Super Stories was released in 1974, which was coordinated with his live-action appearances on The Electric Company. Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, also returned in 1976, this time as a regular comic book, and was written by Jerry Conway, with art by Sal Buscema and Mike Esposito. Marvel, meanwhile, began their Marvel Treasury Edition 1974, which reprinted classic Marvel comics with a new Spider-Man cover by John Romita Sr. Across the pond, Spider-Man Comics Weekly was added as a second comic under the Marvel UK brand, under the Mighty World of Marvel, which featured reprints of the American comic books with new covers. In 1978, it even led to a British superhero, Captain Britain, appearing in America the first time in Marvel Team-Up number 66, written by Chris Claremont and penciled by John Byrne, where he was paired with Spider-Man. This was part of a larger push to get Spider-Man comics overseas, as the character saw translations in multiple languages worldwide. One unique venture was the monthly Shonen magazine in Japan, which was produced by the original Spider-Man manga from January of 1970 to September of 1971, written and drawn by Rijachi Kagima, later joined by Kazuma Harari, who wrote the comic after the first 13-issue story arc. In the series, Yo Kamor is bitten by a radioactive spider to become Spider-Man. He had an Aunt May, spelled M-E-I, and fought Japanese versions of his villains like Electro and the Lizard. The graphic novel ended up being more popular in Japan than its American counterpart, though like many manga series, was notably more violent and sexualized than American comics. It would finally be released in America in December 1997, translated by Musumu Masada and C.B. Sobeski. Back in America, Spider-Man appeared in the cover of Pro magazine, which was also featured 8 other Marvel superheroes, such as The Thing and Captain America. It remains one of the more unique promotions that was only available at NFL stadiums. After another more obscure campaign was posters and greeting cards by Third Eye, meant to appeal to college students, which featured various Marvel superheroes by its artists, with Spider-Man appearing in one with the Submariner drawn by Jen Colin. In a further expansion of Spider-Man's media dominance, Rolling Stone ran an article on September 16, 1971, called Spider-Man's Secret Life, meant as a backstory expose of Marvel. Cream magazine on April 1973 featured a cover by John Romita Sr. with an article by Mike Barron, which claimed that Stan Lee had to be convinced by Jerry Conway to do the drug issue, a strange and contradictory revelation based on the other interviews. All this was tied into another venture for Spider-Man, as Marvel produced a vinyl album with Buddha Records called From the Beyond the Grave, written by Steve Lemberg, and performed by the Web Spinners. Pretty catchy name for the material. The album featured art by John Romita Sr. and followed the story of Kingpin kidnapping Aunt May while also retelling Spider-Man's origin. A costume actor was hired to promote its release, which had lead vocals done by Ron Dante, the lead singer of the Archies, and Peter Parker was voiced by Ron Enornes, the known character actor for his roles in TV series The Bensons and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It would later be released in 1988 as a picture CD, and has been remembered best as called bubblegum cheese, as many call it. In 1973, an unauthorized film, Three Dev Adam, Three Giant Men, was made in Turkey, featuring very loose adaptations of Spider-Man and Captain America. Outside of appearances, the characters had nothing to do with their counterparts, especially Spider-Man, who is a criminal mastermind who tortures victims with guinea pigs. Seriously, look it up on YouTube, it's pretty messed up. Naturally, Marvel has long distanced itself from this illegally made film, but considering Turkish copyright law at the time, there wasn't much they could do about it. Like I said, there are bits and pieces of it on YouTube. It's very shoddily made, and it's just, well, it's weird. Just check it out. Another album would follow with Spider-Man Rock Reflections of a Superhero in 1975 by Lifelong Records, which featured comics art by John Romita Sr. meshed with Nick Cardy's painted work, with music by David Sanborn, while Stan Lee provided the narration. The album featured songs like Peter Stays and Spider-Man Goes and Gwendolyn. The album was later released in 2000 by Winthrop Records. A different kind of album was from Power Records, which combined comics and audio on a 33 1/3 RPM vinyl album called The Amazing Spider-Man. It features adventures like The Evasion of the Dragon Men and The Mark of the Man-Wolf, which encouraged kids to read comics as albums played. And we will leave you here for now, but as you can see, Spider-Man in a very short time was already debuting in multiple mediums from his comic success. He had multiple record albums and a cartoon series. And coming up, he's about to explode even further as he's about to join live-action TV.